Traditionally, the Sophists' place in our culture is to be the bad guy. They stand to Socrates as the Pharisees stand to Jesus. The word sophistry is their legacy, the practice of specious argumentation. To be a sophist is to be like a shyster lawyer or a political spin doctor, or nowadays like a so-called journalist. A sophist is a speaker who appears to present facts or argumentation that purports to deliver to his hearer the truth, but actually with the intent to mislead, usually for the speaker's own personal or economic gain. That's the dictionary definition of a sophist. Of course, we're talking about something different. We're talking about the original historical group of Greek thinkers who are collectively grouped as sophists. It's something different because we can take for granted that the portrait that we get of the sophists, certainly from Plato, which is one of our main sources for them, is not necessarily a perfectly accurate one. Certainly, no one would want their letter of recommendation or their obituary written by their worst enemy. And there's a reason for that. Perhaps the Pharisees really were as bad as the gospel writers made them out to be, and perhaps the sophists were really as bad as Plato makes them out to be. But probably not. So who were the sophists? It's widely known that the Greek political system in the 5th century was a system of independent city-states. Generally, these were ruled by assemblies and law courts where citizens were allowed to orally present a case, for example, for a new law, or perhaps in defense of a suit that was being brought against them, or promoting a suit that they were bringing against someone else. In these situations, the ability to speak persuasively often meant significant political power or legal victory, and so rhetorical skills were highly valued. The sophists were free-roving teachers of rhetoric who had a reputation for their ability to teach such skills. Given the notion of political rhetoric and given the content of that subject area, there was often a confusion between being good at rhetoric on the one hand and being good, period. These were often confused with one another. There was often a confusion between being a teacher of rhetoric about the good and the just and the pious and so forth, and being a moral teacher, someone who taught people to be good, to be just, to be pious, and so forth. This confusion is natural. After all, if you're going to be teaching a young man how to present a speech in the assembly or in a court of law, you're going to be teaching him how to speak to issues of the common good, of right and wrong, of justice. If you teach him to praise virtues that he doesn't possess, you're teaching him how to be an effective hypocrite. If you teach him to advocate a justice that he doesn't uphold himself or doesn't respect, you're teaching him to be a deceiver. Thus, we can see how there would be social pressure on the sophists to impart the virtues to their students, or at the very least to present themselves as teachers of virtue, along with the ability to speak well. So Plato has Protagoras, a leading sophist, perhaps the most famous one, advertise himself this way in the very first quote there on page 64, number 1. This is coming supposedly out of the mouth of Protagoras as it's dramatized by Plato in the dialogue of the same name. So here's Protagoras speaking. "My boy, if you associate with me, the result will be that that very day, the very day you begin, you will return home a better person. And the same will happen the next day too. Each day you will make constant progress toward being better. Protagoras teaches a young man good counsel concerning his personal affairs, so he may best manage his own household. And also concerning the city's affairs, so that as far as the city's affairs go, he may be most powerful in acting and in speaking. Note Plato's literary talent here. He succeeds in conveying the smarminess of Protagoras' manner. Would you buy a used car from that guy? Probably not. But we see how the self-advertisement of Protagoras emphasizes that I will make you better if you come to learn rhetoric from me. I'm not just going to be teaching you how to speak about virtue. I'm going to teach you to be virtuous. Here apparently is where the Sophist title of the wise man originated. Wisdom in the ancient Greek sense meant first and foremost knowing how to live well. It could also mean knowing the causes of things, the origins of things, especially the ways of the gods. And this is what the pre-Socratic cosmologists were after. However, the Sophists, interestingly, compared to the pre-Socratics we've looked at in previous videos, seem to be generally more skeptical about this type of knowledge, this cosmological knowledge. The Sophists were often associated with the doctrine of relativism. The Sophist Protagoras in particular had this reputation. He's credited with the famous line that a person is the measure of all things, is the way it's inclusively translated here. But the dictum is famous in the history of Western civilization in its more masculinist form. So we'll just familiarize yourself with this, and you can decide what you want to do with it, because you'll see this all over the place in literature and various sources in the history of Western civilization, that the idea that man is the measure of all things. And that's what this means, a person. I mean, the problem with the translation, a person, is that you want to ask, well, which person? And clearly here, the idea is expressed that it's, the human being, our species, is the measure of things. It's a kind of humanism, in other words, that's being expressed here. But a person is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. That is, in a nutshell, relativism. Relativism. So, what exists relative to some human conception of it. What is not doesn't exist because human beings have nothing to do with it. If they did, it would exist. That seems to be the idea. The doctrine of relativism has different forms. It can be relativism about truth generally, that there are no truths except relative to some human being's judgment or conception of what's true. It can be the view that there is no right and wrong except relative to some person's idea of right and wrong, or more commonly, and this is most relevant to the Sophist position, that good and evil is really relative to a particular society or a particular culture. So we have the idea of ethical or cultural relativism, which would say that there is good and evil, but there's only good and evil within a particular society. And the judgments that exist about good and evil within, say, Rome, are not necessarily going to be the judgments about good and evil that exist in, let's say, Tehran or someplace. And these are relative only to each city. And in the divided condition of the Greek city-states in this era, what might be considered to be good and noble in Athens, say learning, philosophy, might not be held in such high esteem in Sparta, where military valor and military discipline are considered to be much more important than learning or philosophy. And similarly, neither of those things is important in Corinth, where luxury is considered to be more important than either learning or military discipline for its own sake. So that's the doctrine of relativism in a nutshell. Obviously, if we were going to work this out in more detail, we'd have to say a lot more, but you get the basic idea. Even stated so sketchily as I just did, the doctrine of relativism can be seen as notoriously problematic. Famously, it seems to be self-defeating. So, if you take the principle, all truths are relative, all truths are relative. Well, this purports to be a truth. It gives itself out as true, a true judgment. At least the relativist seems to give it out as a true judgment. And so in that case, we have to ask, well, if this is true, is it just a relative truth? If it's just a relative truth, then I can just safely deny it. And I can say, well, it's not true relative to me. And then, of course, if it's not true, then it would seem to follow quite straightforwardly that relativism is not true. Because this seems to state in one proposition what relativism amounts to. So that's the almost cliched objection to relativism, very familiar probably to most people, even if they've never taken a philosophy course. But it might not be clear exactly what Protagoras really meant by this claim, man is the measure of all things. So I want to look at that a little more closely in a bit. But first I want to continue to just kind of set the context, set the stage, and continue these remarks about the Sophists more collectively before looking at Protagoras in a little more detail later on. So ethical relativism implies that there's no observer independent moral truth. What's good and right is dependent upon who you ask. More often, or most often, in a relativistic framework, moral truths are taken to be culturally determined. People are assumed to answer questions about the good and the right based upon how they were raised, and this in turn depends upon the culture into which they were born. So we might ask, well, why was it that the Sophists were associated with this doctrine, came up with this doctrine? Well, the Sophists, as teachers of rhetoric, tended to travel around. They were itinerant teachers. They would go from city to city and teach rhetoric in different cities. And they were familiar with different customs and practices in different city-states. And because of this, they also had a professional imperative to tailor their rhetoric to the place. Like being a political consultant today, a person wouldn't make the same recommendations in Texas as in Massachusetts. However, the problem was that none of the particular moralities of the particular cities regarded itself as relative. The belief within each city tended to be the naive view that what was good was the good and virtue was virtue and everything else was shameful. Of course, that's an oversimplification. Once, especially the educated elites came into contact with the Sophists and became familiar with these relativistic views, presumably they came to be known and adopted by some within the city, even if they weren't Sophists. But that's a kind of plausible explanation for how relativism arose out of the practice of the Sophists in their teaching of rhetoric from city to city. But what I want to emphasize now is that the way in which the Sophists often found themselves in a tricky position because of the fact that the belief within each city was that the good was just the good. Within Sparta, people believed, presumably, that military discipline was just good in itself, not just good for Spartans. And similarly with Athenians and Corinthians and so forth. So the Sophists often found themselves in a tricky position or in a double-minded position. To be effective at their profession, they had to adopt a kind of facade of taking morality more seriously than they really did, or else hold contrary beliefs in tension with one another. The Sophist perspective also suggests that there's a divide between the human being insofar as he is a citizen of a particular society and the human being as he exists naturally or apart from all societies. As a citizen, he has to conform to the conventions of his society, But as a natural being, he can ask why. Why follow what are, after all, merely conventions? Especially if I can violate them without getting caught. Now, the Sophist antiphon, this is 13.5. His text is on pages 70 and 71 in our text. Antiphon is an example of a sophist who's very aware of the distinction between nature and law, or nature and convention. So we have nature, and this is familiar to us from our discussion of Heraclitus, physis, versus law or convention. And this became a very important distinction once the Sophists came on the scene. The distinction between nature versus law or convention. Physis versus nomoi. Nature versus the laws. For Antiphon, justice itself is conventional. I mean, it's one thing to say that, well, I mean, maybe everyone could agree that I only value learning because I'm an Athenian. I kind of think it's really better than military discipline or luxury, but I'm aware of these differences, and that's fine. We can all accept that there are differences in terms of what different people value in different cities and so forth. But justice is a deeper idea. For most people, it's not obvious that justice is conventional. There seems to be something more fundamental about justice. But for Antiphon, justice itself is conventional, founded upon laws made by men, and this is important, often antithetical to what's naturally good for the individual. So this verses here isn't just meant to point to the distinction between nature and law, although it does do that. It points to the distinction between nature and law, but also refers to an actual opposition that some of the Sophists saw between nature and law. That these things are actually in tension or in actual conflict with one another. In other words, the laws were unnatural, and to be a natural person was to be a kind of outlaw. So what does Antiphon say about that? He says here, this is right at the beginning of the fragment from Antiphon, justice is a matter of not transgressing what the nomalists prescribe in whatever city one is a citizen. Perfectly sort of conventional description of justice, notice here. What's justice? Justice is just abiding by the conventions in whatever city you happen to be. It's a culturally relative conception of justice. A person would make most advantage of justice for himself if he treated the nomoi as important in the presence of witnesses and treated the decrees of physis as important when alone and with no witnesses present. See the double-mindedness I referred to earlier. You do best if you abide by the conventional notions of justice, speak about justice in a conventional way, praise what's conventionally considered to be just, and condemn what's conventionally considered to be unjust when you're in the presence of witnesses. But don't take that too seriously. When you're home alone by yourself and you're just, as it were, speaking to your own heart, abide by what nature tells you, not what the conventions tell you. For the decrees of nomoi are extra additions. Those of physis are necessary. Those of the nomoi are products of agreement, not of natural growth, where those of physis are products of natural growth, not of agreement. If those who made the agreement do not notice a person transgressing the prescriptions of nomoi, he is free from both disgrace and penalty, but not so if they do notice them. But if, contrary to possibility, anyone violates any of the things that are innate by physis, the harm is no less if no one notices, and no greater if all observe, for he does not suffer harm as a result of opinion, but as a result of truth. And here's something we all know. We too speak of, the laws of justice and the laws of nature, but we know that if you can get away with violating the laws of justice as an outlaw, then no harm will necessarily come to you. But you can't escape the laws of nature. Try as you might, to escape the law that if you drink, hydrochloric acid or something like that, you won't be harmed. the law of nature is intractable. You will be harmed no matter what you do. You can't escape. But of course, you can even murder and get away with it. So that's what he's pointing out here, is that the law of nature, this is clearly a much stronger lawgiver, nature, than convention. Conventions are just made by men. Nature comes from a deeper source and is more domineering in its lawgivingness. So what does that suggest? Well, if there actually is a conflict between nature and law, whenever possible, one is going to want to, in one's choices, choose to abide by what nature decrees, not what law decrees. This is the entire purpose of considering these matters, that most of the things that are just according to nomos are established in a way that is hostile to physis. That's the basic point. In other words, there's actually a hostility between these two. The laws that are established are actually hostile to nature and are unnatural. For nomoi have been established for the eyes as to what they must see and what they must not, and for the ears as to what they must hear and what they must not, and for the tongue as to what it must say and what it must not, and for the hands as to what they must do and what they must not, and for the feet as to where they must do and where they must not, and for the mind as to what it must desire and what it must not. Right? There's a law for everything. Everything's covered by some law. Laws are all over the place. You're bound by laws that you don't even realize. You might be surprised, for example, when you do mandatory training in terms of learning let's say the Title IX laws or the state sexual harassment laws, that there's all this pages and pages of law out there that you didn't know existed, but that you're bound by. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just talking about one narrow area. There are all kinds of laws in all kinds of areas. Too many laws. So that's what he's pointing to there, it seems like. And he says, now the things from which the nomoi deter humans are no more in accord with or suited to physis than the things that they promote. He takes a pretty extreme position here. He's saying, all of these laws, why do they exist? They exist to restrain physis. They exist to restrain nature. That's why they exist. They're opposed to nature. They're hostile to nature. They're oppressors. They're oppressive to nature. Living and dying are matters of physis, and living results for them from what is advantageous, dying from what is not advantageous. But the advantages that are established by the nomoi are bounds on physis, and those established by physis are free. So the laws of nature really are laws of freedom. They're to follow nature. This is a view not all that foreign to, let's say, the view of modern bohemians or hippies. It says just, act naturally, be a natural person. And if you just act in accordance with your nature, then you'll be free. That's what he's saying here. But these nomoi, these conventional laws, they exist to restrict your nature. They're oppressors. They don't make you free. What is it to act in accordance with nature? Well, he goes on to say, essentially, do what feels good. Do what gives you pleasure and avoid what pains you. And so things that cause pain, at least when thought of correctly, do not help physis more than things that give pleasure. Therefore, it will not be painful things that are advantageous rather than pleasant things. Trust your body. What's your body telling you is good? When your body is pleased, it's telling you that something is good. When your body is pain, it's telling you something's not good. That's what it's saying. Listen to your body. Exercise as long as it feels good and invigorating, but when it starts to be painful, stop. When you're hungry, eat. But when you start to get over full and you start to feel sick, stop eating, etc. For things that are truly advantageous must not cause harm but benefit. The things that are advantageous by physis are among these, and then there's a ellipsis and a text breaks off. But you get the idea here that we see the advocacy of natural goods like life and pleasure over conventional laws that would infringe upon them. Often the sophist position of favoring nature over convention in this way was received with an anxiety by the so-called pillars of society, as you might call them, an anxiety on their part that absent the constraints that society imposes, humans will become like savage beasts, driven only by aggressive instincts and lust. This is the usual attitude of the busybodies who want to control your life. That you can't be trusted to just follow your own nature. Harm is going to come to you and to others if you do that. From some sophist point of view, though, clearly ethical judgments were not etched in stone. And for many of them, they were, as we see in Antiphon there, they were a medium for manipulation, a means to an end. These laws, these nomoi, could be manipulated in order to increase your own natural flourishing. Typically, increase your power, increase your pleasure. Hippias expresses this pretty clearly. Laws are made by men and can be remade by men. This is number 70 there. Hippias, page 70 rather, number 2. He says, how can anyone suppose that laws are a serious matter or believe in them? Etched in stone. What does that suggest? It suggests the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments that come from God. Your laws are, in that sense, something believed in. It's believed that they have some kind of divine warrant, some kind of divine authority to them. And Hippias says, how can anyone take that seriously? Since it often happens that the very people who make them repeal them and substitute and pass others in their place. This is a real problem for respect for law. If you have this idea that human beings are the ones who institute the laws and can repeal them, why respect them? Well, the answer is that you're afraid of the penalties that are attached to violations of law. But what if you can get away with it? Why respect the law just for the sake of the law? That becomes a question for political philosophy. However, we should recognize the tension in this position. To posit an end or goal of human action, like the natural goal of achieving political power or wealth through making moralizing speeches in the assembly, that is to acknowledge a kind of ethic, a kind of natural ethic. It's not just living in an unreflective sort of animal fashion by, instincts, just acting on whatever your strongest instinct is of the moment. No, the Sophists are certainly advocating a particular type of ethic, an ethic grounded in nature as opposed to convention, but an ethic nonetheless. And so this creates a potential ambiguity in our understanding of what we mean by an ethic. On the one hand, we could mean something like the set of moral conventions that a person lives under and these often correspond to the nomoi, or the laws of the society that one lives under, the laws and conventions. And then there's the notion of the good life for that person. And this would correspond to the phusis ethic. This is the ambiguity that arises when the Sophists distinguish between nomoi and phusis and propose an ethic that is not based upon the conventional ethic, but rather based upon what is good for the person naturally. So what's the good natural life? What sorts of life and pleasure are the natural ones? This remains a question that could be posed to a sophist like Antiphon. And this notion, therefore, or the two notions of an ethic, also suggests a question about whether these are both just two divergent possibilities, or whether one is derived from the other. So sophists like Antiphon and some of the sophists that we see in Plato's dialogues, especially Callicles and the Gorgias and Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, seem to suggest that B here derives or is thought to derive from A, but that's an error. That people think that the good life will be living in accordance with the convention, but they say, well, that's actually not the case. We might think, though, then, so the alternative that they would propose would be to say, okay, there's a different source for the good life. The phusis diverges from these two, so they go apart from each other. But we might also ask whether A could be derived from B, that is, whether there could be a conventional set of laws that are shared in common and abided by in the city that are derived from an idea of the good life in the natural sense. In other words, a city that was, as it were, a natural city, a free city, that actually expressed the natural goodness of human beings rather than oppressed it. That seems to be a position that Antiphon doesn't consider, but it's advocated in the text known as the anonymous Iamblichi, which begins on page 72. So this is obviously anonymous. But here we have a writer who is expressing, and I'll just summarize the position here rather than quote, but it's pretty straightforward. You can read it for yourself. But there's a list here of the ways in which a city that abides by the laws, that's a law-like city, and this is the city that has the quality of eunomia, which is the condition where the people are law-abiding, versus anomia, which is the condition where they aren't. So that's this distinction. And so this anonymous text is claiming that, or arguing actually, giving evidence for why the city that exhibits eunomia is better than the city that exhibits anomia. And better in what sense? Well, better according to a natural standard, right? It would be trivial for this person to just argue, well, it's better in the sense that people are living in a more conventional, law-abiding way. That's the definition of eunomia, so that's not very informative. But what this author wants to argue is that actually, from a natural perspective, in terms of living the more pleasant life, eunomia is the more desirable condition. So this is, in other words, the more pleasant life, whereas the anomic life is the less pleasant life. And so by a natural standard, in other words, the conventional life is actually better. And so, contra what Antiphon was arguing, there is no opposition between phusis and nomoi, between nature and convention, but actually the most natural or most naturally satisfied and fulfilled life would be the one lived within a city-state that had certain conventions that were actually followed, and the people were law-abiding. So there's a number of points that he makes here. Like I said, I won't dwell too much on this. You can read it yourself, and you probably aren't going to be surprised if you haven't read it yet what he says. He says things like, well, in a law-abiding city, you can have things like money and credit circulating. You can have, security of property, and you have a well-governed government rather than a corrupt government, which enables all kinds of things to happen in the city that otherwise wouldn't occur. And you're better prepared to deal with natural disasters and war and various misfortunes that can befall the city if you've got an orderly city than if you don't, and so on. So it's argued that this anomia leads to a less pleasant life and thereby thwarts the natural ethic that some sophists promoted over the conventional ethic. So this shows that the distinction between the natural and the conventional is not clear cut. However, some sophists still rejected most societies, especially democratic leveling societies that treated people as equal, treated people who were naturally unequal as equal. That view was thought of as unnatural. So we see this dramatized very forcefully in Plato's dialogues, especially, as I mentioned earlier, the Gorgias and the Republic. So the idea here is that even if this democratic society, relatively speaking, of course, we're talking about ancient democracies, not modern democracies, but even if these societies that are moderately egalitarian are good for most people, they're unnatural because they're bad for the exceptional people. And nature rewards the exceptional people. So the truly natural state of affairs is one in which the exceptional people can rise up over the unexceptional people and dominate them. That's an attitude you'll see. And we see a revival of this attitude in the moral and political thought of Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher and cultural critic, who also emphasized the aristocratic over the democratic. This leads to our first discussion question. Do you agree with Antiphon's view that the nomoi or conventional laws we live under are unnatural and harmful to those who submit to them? Or, on the contrary, do you agree with the position of the anonymous Iamblichi that eunomia justifies the laws from a natural perspective? Explain why you take the position you do and justify it. So that's the first discussion question. Do you agree with Antiphon's view that the nomoi or conventional laws we live under are unnatural and harmful to those who submit to them? Or, on the contrary, do you agree with the position of the anonymous Iamblichi that eunomia justifies these laws? Explain why you take the position you do and justify it. Now, not surprisingly, modern relativists and staunch anti-Platonists tend to view the sophists more sympathetically than Plato did. And first among these is, once again, Nietzsche, who was, for the most part, a virulent critic of Socrates, whom he regarded as a decadent, and Plato, who he regarded as a noble youth who was unfortunately infected with Socrates' spiritual corruption. Nietzsche believed that Socrates' sentence, when he was tried at Athens and sentenced to death, he believed it was really just, because Socrates really was corrupting the youth. He was actually guilty of what he was accused of, contrary to the conventional opinion that we've inherited through centuries in our culture, that Socrates was a victim, a martyr, analogous to Jesus or something like that. So Nietzsche says, no, he actually was guilty. He was a corrupter of the youth. The sophists, Nietzsche argued, appreciated the perspectival character of all knowledge. Perspectival character of all knowledge. In other words, every knowledge claim, every claim that these are the facts, this I know, that's the way it is, etc., etc. Every such claim is actually just the expression of a particular perspective on something. There are no undisputed facts, according to Nietzsche, only interpretations. Every interpretation can be contested by another interpretation. Even when it comes to science, we need to recognize that what is accepted research today will be supplanted by new research tomorrow. Actually, this is blatantly obvious when it comes to things like diet, for example. A new study comes out and shows XYZ is harmful to you. Just wait long enough. 10 years from now, another study will come out showing that actually it's beneficial. That tends to be I'm probably overstating the case, but that tends to be the way it goes. And so the people who are really staunch objectivists about science tend to be also ignorant of the history of science and not seeing the way in which science changes over time, and research that's accepted as true one particular era is supplanted in a later era. In other words, the Heraclitean flow of contradictions that we talked about earlier, for Nietzsche, rules over all being. Everything is in flux. There is no stable becoming where we can anchor ourselves. And this can be a hard truth to accept because it means physis cryptestai filiae. Physis cryptestai filiae. If you remember that from the video on Heraclitus, this was the Greek for this phrase that's often translated, nature loves to hide, which I suggested following a French intellectual historian. This could also be translated as everything that is born loves to die. Everything that is born loves to die. But that's how it is. There's no point in running away from reality. You're rotting, and you're eventually going to be worm food. And all the plastic surgery in the world isn't going to help. So there's no point in running away from reality. Everything that is born loves to die. That's Nietzsche's position. But I'm mentioning this here because he thought that some of the Sophists really appreciated this. And for that reason, he admired them and regarded them as actually being more advanced philosophically than Plato and Aristotle, who, of course, have held this dominant position in our culture for millennia. Nietzsche regarded that as rather disastrous. Of course, Nietzsche was also a great admirer of Heraclitus as well as Empedocles. Socrates and Plato, by contrast, he thought were decadents who couldn't handle the truth, in the words of A Few Good Men. That's Nietzsche's word to Socrates and Plato: you can't handle the truth. They sought rather to arrest the flow of being by denying its existence, by, as it were, putting blinders on and denying the existence of reality as it was, and instead replacing it with a fantasy reality of eternal, unchanging truths that was modeled on mathematics. They, that is Socrates and Plato, especially Plato, posited another world of immaterial reality without change, where the soul could be immortal and live on after the perishing of the body. But from Nietzsche's perspective, this is just cowardice and psychological weakness, and signals. That's where this idea of decadence comes in. They're decadent because it signals a kind of physical degeneration, that they couldn't handle reality, and so they had to create these imaginary thought castles in their heads to replace reality with. Likewise, one can see sympathies for the Sophists in certain post-Nietzscheans, that is to say, philosophers who came after Nietzsche or were influenced by Nietzsche in various ways, but these post-Nietzscheans who had similar suspicions of Socrates and Plato, such as the 20th century philosophers Jacques Derrida, father of deconstruction, and Richard Rorty, one of the major figures in the neo-pragmatist revival of American philosophy. So the Sophists remain important today to know about as a group. Of the individual Sophists, Protagoras may be the most well-known. So let's look at him a little more closely. Returning to Protagoras' famous relativistic claim, number 8, a person is the measure of all things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. This is the claim that you'll find as a motto recurring in various contexts in the history of our culture, as man is the measure of all things, typically. The famous relativistic claim. So what I want to suggest now is that it's not clear how he arrived at this position, just from the claim itself. It's not clear how he arrived at this position. And that makes a difference to how we understand what actually is being said here. If we view it as an a priori dogmatic position that all truth is relative, then it's easily refuted, as I noted earlier. However, to me at least, it seems at least equally likely, if not more likely, that this is an inductive a posteriori claim, that it summarizes Protagoras' experience of humankind. In particular, we have two sets of bracketing fragments here. So we have 5, 6, and 7, the three before the famous claim in section or fragment 8, and then 8, 9, and 10 after it. And these actually, I think, are well edited because it suggests how Protagoras may have arrived at this position. So here's what 5, 6, and 7 say. 5 says, concerning the gods, I am unable to know either that they are or that they are not, or what their appearance is like. For many are the things that hinder knowledge, the obscurity of the matter, and the shortness of human life. What are the gods like? What's God really like? Well, this, theology, this is dealing with the highest things that are way above us and that are really obscure, which of course suggests that our puny human minds aren't really able to wrap themselves around these such matters. Any more than, when my cat walks in the room, my cat can understand what I'm doing right now, speaking to this, flat surface in this way. How can we hope to comprehend the gods? And similarly, our lives are so short, they're so brief, we barely get started. And this is even more the case today than it was, in the pre-Socratic era. Even if you pick a very narrow specialization, you can barely, get halfway through all the literature that's been generated in your specialization before you die. So, how can we possibly hope to comprehend the gods? Number 6, it's not true that geometry studies perceptible magnitudes, for perceptible lines are not the kinds of things the geometer talks about, since no perceptible thing is straight or curved in that way, nor is a circle tangent to a ruler at a point, but the way Protagoras used to say in refuting the geometers. Yeah, a line, right? A line is perfectly straight. There's nothing perfectly straight in the world. A point is supposed to have no extension. But of course, no matter how fine a point you put on it, it does have some extension. You get a microscope and you can see how, it's extended in space. It's a circle with a certain diameter. There's no perfect triangle or perfect square or perfect circle. These things are not perceived. Mathematics deals with just ideas, ideal things that don't actually exist in reality. So Protagoras says of mathematics, the subject matter is unknowable and the terminology distasteful. To the extent that we think that mathematics actually concerns the structure of the world, there's a real question about that, because isn't this just a kind of idealization of the world? Isn't any mathematical model that is constructed even today in physics just a kind of simplification of the world? An abstraction from the world, the simplification of it. It's not some kind of absolute picture of the world. It leaves so much out. And it falsifies the world. It falsifies the world because it posits things that are perfect that don't actually exist in the world. So these fragments actually remind me of a famous passage in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I don't know if you have this edition. This is a good translation by Richard Pavir and Larissa Volokonsky. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can see that there. You want to get this one? Since this is published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. You can see there. But this famous passage, this is in the lead up to one of maybe the most famous section of this book, the discussion of the Grand Inquisitor. But the passage I want to read from here, this is just a page of this work. It's part of a rant delivered by an irreligious intellectual, Ivan Karamazov, one of the title characters, to his younger, more religious and idealistic brother, Alexei. And in it, he notes how scientists have begun to develop non-Euclidean geometries and raise the possibility that these non-Euclidean geometries may describe nature better than Euclidean, which of course we know is now the case in the advanced areas of physics. So Ivan Karamazov says this fact leads him to renounce once and for all the effort to pronounce any opinions about God and the meaning of life. If he can't even understand the latest physics, how can he possibly understand God? Right? I mean, think about that. So someone who makes claims, someone's prepared to make claims about God and what God wants and what God knows and what God thinks and what God did, for example, help you find your car keys. But they're a million years away from being able to comprehend even physics. How could they possibly claim to understand something that's far above physics, namely God? That's the idea that I'm suggesting. There's a connection here between what Protagoras is expressing millennia ago and what Ivan Karamazov is expressing here. So here's what he says. Karamazov speaking, and you could think here, imagine Protagoras is saying something like this. As for me, I long ago decided not to think about whether man created God or God created man. My task is to explain to you as quickly as possible my essence, that is, what sort of man I am, what I believe in, and what I hope for. And I therefore declare that I accept God, pure and simple. But this, however, needs to be noted. If God exists, and if he indeed created the earth, then as we know perfectly well, he created it in accordance with Euclidean geometry, and he created human reason with a conception of only 3 dimensions of space. At the same time, there were and are even now geometers and philosophers, even some of the most outstanding among them, who doubt that the whole universe, or even more broadly, the whole of being, was created purely in accordance with Euclidean geometry. They even dare to dream that 2 parallel lines, which according to Euclid cannot possibly meet on Earth, may perhaps meet somewhere in infinity. I, my dear, have come to the conclusion that if I cannot understand even that, then it is not for me to understand about God. I humbly confess that I do not have any ability to resolve such questions. I have a Euclidean mind, an earthly mind, and therefore it is not for us to resolve things that are not of this world. And I advise you never to think about it. Never think about it, my friend, and most especially about whether God exists or not. All such questions are completely unsuitable to a mind created with a concept of only 3 dimensions. And so I accept God, not only willingly, but moreover, I also accept his wisdom and his purpose, which are completely unknown to us. I believe in order and the meaning of life. I believe in eternal harmony, in which we are all supposed to merge. I believe in the Word for whom the universe is yearning, and who himself was with God, and who himself is God, and so on and so forth and so on to infinity. But in other words, we don't have the foggiest idea what any of this means. Our minds just are not able to grasp this. So perhaps Protagoras arrived at a similar insight millennia earlier than Dostoevsky. The position man is the measure could be taken as a statement of what we might call epistemic or epistemological humility. Epistemological humility, that is humility in our theory of knowledge. All we know is what our puny human Euclidean, who wasn't born yet, when Protagoras was writing, or not writing, or teaching, but all we know is what our puny human brains tell us, our Euclidean brains. We cannot grasp the answers to the questions that these cosmologists ask, for example. Also related to this, in 10 through 12, we see anticipation of a view famously associated with Martin Luther, the Protestant Martin Luther, his view that, namely, that reason is a whore. Reason is a whore. That is, you can come up with a convincing argument for any and every position, including contradictory positions if you're clever enough. Reason, in other words, is a prostitute that's for sale. Sorry if the strong language is offensive. What if I would have said reason is a hoe? Is that less offensive? I'm not sure. But at any rate, that's what Luther said, so blame him if you find that offensive. So section number 10 says, Protagoras was the first to declare that there are two mutually opposed arguments on any subject. Protagoras, number 11, Protagoras made the weaker and stronger argument and taught his students to blame and praise the same person. And then in number 12, Aristotle says, this is making the weaker argument stronger, and people were rightly annoyed at Protagoras' promise to be able to make the weaker argument the stronger. Now, fragment 9, which seems to go with these others, is more ambiguous. It reads this way. This is from Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Philosophers. And so Diogenes, speaking of Protagoras, says, he was the first to use in dialectic the argument of Antisthenes that attempts to prove that contradiction is impossible. So who is this Antisthenes? Like most of these figures, we don't have any writings from him. According to the same Diogenes Laertius, Antisthenes was a contemporary of Socrates and Protagoras, and a disciple of both the sophist Gorgias and later Socrates, if the same Antisthenes is meant. So Antisthenes shifted from Gorgias, the sophist, and later to Socrates from the conventional view of our culture, our civilization. That meant he went from the dark side of the force to the light side of the force. But that just makes it unclear even more what this claim, contradiction is impossible, meant. Diogenes Laertius, in his description of this figure who wrote nothing, doesn't give this argument. So it's unclear what contradiction is impossible meant. Did this mean that the principle of non-contradiction, the principle, in other words, that nothing can be both true and not true of the same thing at the same time, this principle, fundamental principle of logic, was he merely asserting this principle? Is that what it means? Contradiction is impossible? Is that just a way of asserting the principle of non-contradiction? Contradiction is impossible means nothing can be both true and not true of the same thing at the same time. So is this argument a proof of the principle like the kind Aristotle gives in the Metaphysics? If so, then Protagoras would also be an advocate of the normative standard of logical consistency. In other words, even if he was a relativist about truth, he still argued that the position one takes ought to be at least consistent. If that's what he was doing here, if he was actually defending the principle of non-contradiction. So there is some standard, there is some non-relative truth. Perhaps you and your neighbor can't criticize each other's positions in terms of the internal content and substance of the positions, because what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for your neighbor is true for your neighbor. But at least if he's holding a logically, internally inconsistent position, and you can criticize your neighbor for holding a position that is contradictory with itself, so you could at least criticize him for holding a logically inconsistent position. Should that be the case? So that's one possibility for what this is saying, that asserting the contradiction is impossible. Protagoras is affirming the principle of non-contradiction. However, perhaps what he was saying is something a bit different, and this seems a little bit more likely, because as we'll see in a bit, another sophist by the name of Prodicus also held the view that contradiction is impossible. And in his case, this appears to have meant the rather implausible claim that no two people ever contradict one another. We will, as I said, look at Prodicus in a minute, but what if Protagoras meant something like this as well, that no two people ever contradict one another? No two people ever contradict one another. What? Can we make sense of this? How can we give this a charitable interpretation? Well, maybe something like this, especially in the context of these other views that are attributed to him. Maybe Protagoras is saying something like this. In real life, just like we don't find any true lines or mathematical points or circles in the mathematical sense, we don't find anything answering to our mathematical models in real life. Also, in real life, no logical argument is ever decisive. Even in a valid argument, one's always free to bite the bullet and reject one of the premises. if one is bound and determined to accept the conclusion. Furthermore, in dialectic, as the fragment says, that is, in conversation, it's impossible really to trap anyone in a contradiction, because one is always able to modify or qualify one's position, as we see over and over again in Plato's dialogues. This tends to support relativism in that it shows that outside of formal mathematics, no argument truly has the status of a demonstration. Outside of formal mathematics, there are no proofs. There are no non-mathematical proofs, strictly speaking. Only shifting positions and arguments. This other figure, Stephanus of Byzantium, he notes that Protagoras taught his pupils to be able to argue both sides of every argument. There's nothing wrong with that. We call that teaching critical reasoning nowadays, as opposed to indoctrination. Indoctrination is only teaching one side of an argument and presenting it as if that's the only thing that can be taken seriously. So Protagoras should be praised for teaching both sides of an argument. Although one could see that, for the advocates of, let's say, the conventional position or the established position, to see the other side presented might have caused them some discomfort. But that's a good thing. There's a reason for doing this. The reason for doing this is that it's usually unclear or it's in dispute which argument really is the stronger and really is the weaker on most disputed questions. Of course, everyone thinks that the one that they support or believe in is the stronger argument. That's almost logically necessary. Certainly psychologically seems to be necessary. But we can also step back from that and realize that it's not actually settled which is the stronger and which is the weaker on most questions. Aristotle makes Protagoras sound more nefarious when he claims that Protagoras made the weaker argument the stronger and even, bragged about this. But he neglected to add that this is Aristotle's position, or this is Aristotle's view, a generation later, of what Protagoras was about, no doubt colored through the view that he received from Plato and the Platonic Academy. Every party to a lawsuit who's ever lost a court case thought the opposing lawyer made the weaker argument the stronger. So from, let's say, Nietzsche's perspective, this is just a feature of the perspectival character of all knowledge. Which argument's weaker, which argument's stronger depends upon your perspective. And this may have been precisely Protagoras' point, that there are two sides to every issue and that we are not God, and we cannot know the mind of God. We lack the ability to transcend the situation and survey the matter from the God's eye point of view and judge it from nowhere. So this leads to the second discussion question. What do you think Protagoras meant by a person is the measure of all things? Do you find this position to be plausible? Why or why not? What arguments might be raised against it? Okay, second discussion question. What do you think Protagoras meant by a person is the measure of all things, etc.? I'm asking, of course, about the whole number 8. Do you find this position to be plausible? Why or why not? What arguments might be raised against it? Just a couple of remarks about Gorgias and Prodicus before we wrap up. Gorgias, with the sophist Gorgias, we see further instances of the kind of what I would describe as psychological realism that we find in Protagoras. And also, consequently, the epistemological skepticism that goes along with this. To be a realist about human psychology is to be a skeptic epistemologically, to realize how limited and fallible the human mind is. Gorgias emphasizes in particular how most people are psychologically very persuadable. Smooth talkers who are masters of the logos or masters of speech can compel the soul to take a certain doxa or opinion because most people lack, he says, a good memory on the one hand, or a good foreknowledge, prudence, we might say. And you see this all the time, that, the changeability of people's opinions based upon the latest thing, forgetting very quickly what they believed in the past or what seemed to be the pressing thing in the past. And also the way that people behave with a lack of foreknowledge or a lack of prudence or foresight. Most people, in other words, live in the moment governed by opinion. So someone comes along with a powerful speech, and these opinions can be easily changed. And today, this occurs through the electronic media, but it's the same principle. And then finally, Prodicus. Prodicus is interesting mainly for this fragment number 1 here, which returns to this idea that no two people ever contradict one another. So it says, there's a reference to the paradoxical view of Prodicus that contradiction is impossible. What does this mean? It goes against everyone's judgment and opinion. For in both practical and intellectual matters, we are constantly conversing with people who contradict us. He says dogmatically that contradiction is impossible because if two people contradict each other, they are both speaking, but they cannot both be speaking with reference to the same fact. He says that only the one who speaks the truth is reporting the fact as it is, while the person who contradicts him does not state the fact. Here, the position seems to be that the person who does not speak the truth is not really contradicting the person who speaks the truth because they're really talking about different things. In other words, they're talking past each other, as we say. In the typical case, I suppose that the non-truth speaker will be referring to something that exists in their mind. Since the truth speaker is not referring to something in the non-truth speaker's mind, but rather to something in the world, they're not really disagreeing. The problem with this view, if I'm interpreting it correctly, which is a big if, the problem with this view is it would make language radically subjective, it would seem. Language would no longer have a public meaning, but would be assigned a meaning based upon what's going on in the mind of each speaker. Each speaker would assign his own private meaning to their words. But if that's the case, then communication is impossible. Your words wouldn't mean what my words mean. Perhaps this is an example of how Sophists could get tripped up and trip others up with oversettled reasoning. However, it does raise, I think, an interesting metaphysical question about how we refer to what is not. And therefore, it connects up with this central issue in Parmenides that was so influential for post-Parmenidean cosmology, the question of the existence of what is not. But here we're talking really about a question more in the philosophy of language, how we refer to what is not. So take an example. If I say that Manal Boulevard in Albuquerque is south of I-40, and you say it is north of I-40, most people would say that you are contradicting me. Unless, of course, the streets intersect or something like that, but let's abstract from that possibility. So most people would say you're contradicting me. Let's just suppose these are parallel streets, I-40 and Manal. Prodicus, however, denies that this is a contradiction for the reason that we're not referring to the same thing. You're referring to something that really exists. You can go there. This is why I chose this geographical example that I now realize it might have been a little bit confusing, but you could go there. You can actually go to the route north of I-40 in Albuquerque named Manal. I, on the other hand, fail to refer at all because there is nothing corresponding to what I have in mind. There exists no route south of I-40 named Manal, at least not in Albuquerque, right? So I can travel up some north-south route like, I don't know, Louisiana or whatever, and I'm going to get to I-40 and I'm never going to get to Manal. I hope this is the case. But I think that's right. So there's a real puzzle here. In other words, how can one refer to something that does not exist? How can one refer to something that does not exist? And this is going to be our third discussion question, which we'll end the video with. Third discussion question, how would you assess Prodicus's claim that if two people contradict one another, they cannot both be speaking with reference to the same fact? Is this claim based upon a fallacy that is a logical mistake? If so, how would you correct it? Third discussion question, how would you assess Prodicus's claim that if two people contradict one another, they cannot both be speaking with reference to the same fact? Is this claim based upon a fallacy, a logical mistake? If so, how would you correct it? So that will do it for the Sophists and for the pre-Socratics generally. Next, we will begin Plato.